Mr. President, since December 2014, that's back when the United States and Cuba ended 50 years of diplomatic isolation that really accomplished nothing good for the people of Cuba or the United States. Since we ended that, there's been an explosion of engagement between our two countries. The number of U.S. citizens traveling to Cuba has skyrocketed. Talks between both governments have resulted in agreements to resume direct airline and ocean ferry and mail service. It's expanded cooperation on a wide range of bilateral and regional issues. Those are encouraging steps, but there's a long road ahead. You know, for 50-some years, no matter whatever problems there were in Cuba, the Cuban government could blame it on the United States because of our embargo and our resistance to recognize him. Well, some members of Congress have expressed disappointment. They criticized President Obama's opening to Cuba because the restoration of diplomatic relations is not quickly brought about. Dramatic changes in Cuba's repressive political system. We did not turn around 54 years in 54 days. Well, these members of Congress are either naive or they simply prefer to ignore the positive changes that are occurring. Choose to ignore or dismiss the views of the overwhelming majority of Cubans and Americans who support the restoration of relations. And they continue defending a discredited policy of isolation that for 50-some-odd years failed to achieve any of its objectives. In fact, as President Obama said, if you try something for 50 years and it doesn't work, then it's time to try something else. In the past 15 months, although the naysayers won't publicly admit it, the Cuban people have a sense of hope about the future that has not existed since the 1959 revolution. I know, I've seen it in all my trips there. But it's also important to recognize that the majority of Cubans alive today were born after the revolution. And just as Cuba's population has changed, so has the world changed. Overwhelmingly, Cuba's younger generation has experienced enough of a paternalistic communist dictatorship and economic stagnation to know that's not what they want. It is no surprise that their reaction to President Obama's extraordinary speech in Havana was warmly, enthusiastically greeted by them. In fact, several top Cuban officials, sensing the inspiring impact of the president's words, felt compelled to criticize our president. I was there for that speech. I saw the reaction of the Cuban people. It's very positive. The raising of the American flag in Havana last August symbolized the beginning of a new era in U.S.-Cuban relations. But change was happening in Cuba well before then. It's going to continue at its own pace. Ultimately, the Cuban people, not the United States, will determine that pace and what a post-Castro Cuba will look like. But I know my wife Marcella and I stood there at our embassy. As that flag went up, we heard the cheers from the Cuban people standing just outside the gates of our embassy. So we can contribute to the process of change in positive ways. One way is through student exchanges. Last month, Vermont students from Burlington, Essex, Shelburne, and Bristol traveled to Cuba to participate in a week of Little League baseball games and cultural exchange. Marcel and I went to Burlington to see them off, and I cannot begin to explain the thrill in their faces, the excitement there. We gave them an American flag to bring with them. The Vermonters didn't speak much Spanish. The Cubans spoke almost no English. But it didn't really matter. They had translators. The game of baseball is a language across cultures. Here's a picture of them with the American flag that we gave them, Cuban flag they had, and a Vermont flag. This was taken in Cuba. I think I love to take photographs. I wish I'd been there to take that one. But we know a picture is worth 1,000 words. They show just how a few days of competing on a baseball diamond can help to bridge a half-century divide between two countries and cultures. Anybody who has children who played baseball or Little League ball, or now grandchildren, recognize these smiles. We know what it means. They don't speak the same language, they speak one language, that's baseball. The Vermonters voiced high praise for the Cuban players, who won all the games except the All-Star game at the end when they shared players and were evenly matched. But winning isn't everything. And as the Vermont players recounted after returning home, it was not only a fun week of baseball, but one of the most rewarding parts of the trip was the time spent after the game, getting to know the Cuban players, getting to know their families, learning about life in Cuba. Now, this is actually the second baseball exchange involving Vermont and Cuban Little Leaguers. The first being in 2008 when a group from Vermont and New Hampshire played a series of games on the outskirts of Havana. But then one of the players said, the team went to Cuba just to have fun. We're not here to win. They hear about us, maybe other teams will want to do this. Or maybe you can get a Cuban team to the United States to play. Lisa Briganti in my office took this photograph. I think it says it all. You can't see the face. You know one is Cuban and one's American. These are kids playing Little League game. Look what it means. Children don't care about the politics. They don't even care about the differences in language. They just care about the things that unite them. I remember speaking with President Obama shortly after he became president, saying we had to change what's happening in Cuba. Now, he knew that there were memos to him that said, hold tight, and those Cubans, leaders, the two Castros will be gone any day. I pointed out that same memo was sent to President Eisenhower and President Kennedy and President Johnson and President Nixon, and he said, I get your point. Nothing has changed during those more than half a century when we refused to acknowledge their existence. Now I think change will come. Our governments remain far apart on key issues. A minority of members of Congress continue to stubbornly obstruct efforts to end the embargo, but as every poll has shown in this country, the American people, especially young Vermont athletes, are showing us the way forward by breaking down barriers of their own. I am so proud of these young people from Vermont, and I think of what this shows. They know what the future is. The rest of us, let's step forward and see the future with them. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.